You have brilliant ideas, but when you speak, people's eyes glaze over and they check their phones. Every presentation feels like you're talking to a wall, while you watch others with average ideas command the room and get the credit you deserve. I am Dale Carnegie, and I spent decades studying what separates speakers who inspire action from those who simply fill time. Through my work with over 750,000 students and my research into the greatest speakers in history, I discovered that persuasive speaking isn't about perfect delivery, it's about connecting human heart to human heart. What I'm going to share with you will transform you from someone who speaks at people to someone who moves people to action, using the same principles that have launched careers, built empires, and changed the course of history. But first, like this video, subscribe for more life-changing communication wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to master the art of persuasion. Let me take you back to a cold October evening in 1912, when I stood trembling behind a makeshift curtain in a dingy YMCA basement in New York City. In my sweating palms, I clutched a crumpled piece of paper covered with my shaking handwriting notes. For what was supposed to be my first public speaking lesson, I was 24 years old, and I was about to discover that everything I thought I knew about speaking was completely wrong. I had convinced the YMCA director to let me teach a course on public speaking, despite having no formal qualifications. You see, I needed the money desperately. I was a struggling salesman who had moved to New York with big dreams and an empty wallet. The director had reluctantly agreed to give me a chance, but only on commission. I would earn nothing unless people actually showed up and stayed. That first night, 18 brave souls had paid their $2 to learn from me. 18 people who had no idea that their instructor was more terrified than they were. As I listened to their nervous chatter through the thin curtain, my heart pounded so hard I was certain everyone could hear it. When I finally stepped out to face my first class, something magical happened. Completely forgot everything I had planned to say. The carefully crafted introduction I had memorized vanished. The logical progression of points I had outlined disappeared. I stood there, mouth dry, staring at 18 expectant faces, and I did the only thing I could think of via told them the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice barely above a whisper, I am more nervous than any of you will ever be. I have never taught a public speaking class in my life, and right now, I'm wondering if this was the biggest mistake I've ever made. Something extraordinary happened in that moment. Instead of walking out, they leaned forward. Instead of demanding their money back, they smiled. I had stumbled upon the first great secret of persuasive speaking. Vulnerability creates connection faster than expertise ever could. That night, instead of teaching from my notes, I shared my story. I told them about growing up on a Missouri farm, how I was so shy that I would walk an extra mile to avoid meeting someone on the road. I talked about the humiliation I felt when I tried to speak up in school and my voice would crack. I described the burning shame of watching other kids confidently express ideas while I sat silent, even when I knew I had better answers. But I also told them about the moment I realized that my fear was keeping me from the life I wanted. I was tired of watching less capable people advance in business simply because they could speak with confidence. I was exhausted by the frustration of having brilliant ideas die in my throat because I was too afraid to voice them. As I spoke, I watched something happen in their faces. They weren't just listening, they were recognizing themselves in my story. The successful businessman in the front row nodded when I talked about fear. The shy young woman in the back smiled when I mentioned having good ideas but lacking the courage to share them. I was witnessing the power of shared experience to break down barriers. That night changed everything for me. By being authentic about my struggles, I had created more connection in 30 minutes than most speakers achieve in 30 speeches. I learned that people don't want to be impressed by your perfection. They want to be inspired by your journey from imperfection to improvement. Over the following weeks, I watched my students transform, not because I was a polished instructor, but because I was a fellow traveler on the same difficult path. I began to study every great speaker I could find, not just their techniques, but their stories. I discovered that every powerful communicator had one thing in common. They spoke from their scars, not their strengths. This realization led me to develop what would become my life's work, teaching people that the path to persuasive speaking isn't about becoming someone else. It's about becoming the most authentic version of yourself. That trembling piece of paper from my first class became my most treasured possession, not because it contained brilliant teaching points, but because it reminded me that our greatest strengths often emerge from our deepest fears. The 18 people who showed up that first night became the foundation of everything that followed. Word spread about the instructor who admitted his fears and helped others conquer theirs. Within months, I had waiting lists. Within years, I was teaching thousands, not because I had become fearless, but because I had learned to transform fear into fuel for connection. Asterisk, the revelation that changed my entire understanding of persuasion came to me while studying a single piece of paper, Abraham Lincoln's handwritten draft of the Gettysburg Address. I had acquired this precious document during my research into history's greatest speakers, and what I discovered in those margins revolutionized everything I thought I knew about moving people to action. Most people remember the Gettysburg Address for its brevity, just 272 words that redefined a nation's purpose. But what struck me wasn't what Lincoln said, it was what he crossed out. The margins were filled with deletions, revisions, and seemingly simple word choices that revealed the hidden architecture of persuasive speaking. I spent hours analyzing every change Lincoln made, and I began to see a pattern. Every revision moved the speech away from technical perfection and toward emotional truth. Where he had originally written, "We are met on a great battlefield," he changed it to "We are met on a great battlefield of that war." That single addition of that war created intimacy. Suddenly, speaker and audience were united in a shared experience. This is when I understood the fundamental truth that most speakers miss entirely. People don't buy logic. They buy emotion, then use logic to justify their emotional decision. Lincoln wasn't trying to impress his audience with eloquent phrases. He was trying to connect their hearts to his vision of what America could become. I began testing this principle in my own classes, and the results were immediate and dramatic. When I taught students to lead with emotion and support with logic, their persuasive power increased exponentially. When they started with facts and figures, audiences remained politely disengaged. But when they began with stories, personal experiences, and emotional truth, people leaned forward and opened their minds. This discovery led me to what I now call the 3 pillars of persuasive connection. Principles that the ancient Greeks called ethos, pathos, and logos. But I learned that most people get the order completely backwards. Ethos is your credibility, who you are and why people should listen to you. Most speakers try to establish this through credentials and accomplishments, but Lincoln taught me that the most powerful credibility comes from shared humanity. When he said we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground, he wasn't speaking as the president above his audience, he was speaking as a fellow mourner among mourners. Pathos is the emotional connection, how you make people feel. This isn't manipulation. It's recognition that humans are emotional creatures who make decisions with their hearts and justify them with their minds. Lincoln could have recited casualty statistics, but instead he spoke of the brave men, living and dead, who struggled here. He painted pictures that made people feel the weight of sacrifice. Logos is the logical framework, the rational structure that supports the emotional decision people have already made. Notice that Lincoln provided this too, but only after he had established credibility and emotional connection. His logical argument was elegant. We cannot honor this ground because the dead have already consecrated it through their sacrifice. So we must honor them by completing their unfinished work. But here's what most people miss. The order matters tremendously. When you lead with logic, you trigger people's analytical resistance. They start looking for flaws in your reasoning before they've connected with your purpose. When you establish credibility through vulnerability and create emotional resonance, first, people want to find reasons to agree with you. I learned to teach my students this sequence. First, show up as a genuine human being, sharing a genuine concern. Second, help people feel the importance of what you're discussing. Third, provide them with a logical framework they can use to justify the action their hearts already want to take. The magic happens when sincerity trumps eloquence every single time. I've watched stumbling, imperfect speakers move audiences to tears and action, while technically perfect speakers left people cold and unmoved. The difference was always authenticity. People can sense when you're trying to impress them versus when you're trying to serve them. Lincoln understood this intuitively. He wasn't trying to deliver the most beautiful speech ever written. He was trying to help a grieving nation find meaning in tragedy and direction for the future. His goal wasn't applause. It was transformation. And that's exactly what he achieved. When I finally grasped this principle, it changed not just how I taught speaking, but how I lived my life. I stopped trying to be the smartest person in the room and started focusing on being the most useful. I stopped crafting speeches to showcase my knowledge and started creating experiences to serve my audience's needs. This foundation, before logic, connection before correction, service before self, became the bedrock of everything I would teach for the rest of my career. It's the difference between speaking at people and speaking with people, between delivering information and creating transformation. The most embarrassing moment of my early teaching career taught me the most valuable lesson about audience connection. I was speaking to a group of Wall Street executives in 1920, feeling confident in my prepared remarks about the importance of clear communication in business. Halfway through my carefully crafted presentation, I noticed something that stopped me. Every single person in the room was either checking their pocket watch, shuffling papers, or staring out the window. I was committing the fatal sin that destroys more speakers than stage fright ever could. I was talking to myself instead of talking to them. I had spent hours perfecting my content without spending a single minute understanding my audience. That day, I developed what I came to call my audience analysis worksheet, a systematic approach to understanding any group before I ever opened my mouth. The first question I learned to ask wasn't what do I want to say, but what do they need to hear. This shift in perspective changed everything. Those Wall Street executives didn't need another lecture about communication theory. They needed practical solutions to the specific communication breakdowns that were costing them money every single day. I began studying audiences the way a detective studies crime scenes, looking for clues about their concerns, their language, their values, and their resistance points. I discovered that every audience gives you everything you need to know if you just pay attention. Before every speaking engagement, I started arriving early and mingling with attendees. I would listen to their conversations, notice what they complained about, observe what excited them. I learned to read the room's energy level, attention span, and mood. A group of tired salespeople at the end of a long conference needed a completely different approach than an enthusiastic team at a morning meeting. I developed the ability to read micro-expressions and body language in real time. When people lean forward, they're engaged. When they lean back, they're judging. When they cross their arms, they're resistant. When they nod along, they're agreeing. When they tilt their heads, they're confused. These signals became my roadmap for adjusting my message moment by moment. But the real breakthrough came when I realized that what people say they want to hear and what they actually need to hear are often completely different things. A group of managers might ask for leadership techniques, but what they really need is confidence to handle difficult conversations. A sales team might request closing strategies, but what they actually need is belief in the value they provide. Learn to listen for the emotion beneath the request. Fear, frustration, hope, ambition. These emotional undercurrents told me far more about how to connect with my audience than any formal needs assessment ever could. When someone asks how to handle difficult people, they're really asking how to feel more confident in conflict. When someone wants to know about time management, they're often expressing anxiety about falling behind. This understanding led me to develop what I called the pre-speech ritual. 30 minutes before every presentation, I would find a quiet space and mentally rehearse not just my content, but my connection strategy. I would visualize the faces I had seen, remember the conversations I had overheard, and adjust my opening, my examples, and even my energy level to match what the room needed. The most powerful technique I discovered was the art of speaking their language. Every profession, every industry, every group has its own vocabulary, its own metaphors, its own way of seeing the world. When I spoke to farmers, I talked about planting seeds and harvesting results. When I addressed bankers, I used terms like return on investment and risk management. This wasn't manipulation, it was translation. I also learned to identify the informal leaders in every group, the people others looked to for cues about how to respond. There's always someone whose nod of approval or skeptical expression influences the entire room. I made it my mission to connect with these influencers early and often, knowing that winning them would help me win everyone. Perhaps most importantly, I developed the courage to adapt my message in real time based on what I was seeing and feeling from the audience. If my planned opening wasn't landing, I would pivot to a story that better matched their mood. If I sensed confusion, I would slow down and provide more context. If I felt resistance, I would acknowledge it directly and address their concerns. This responsiveness transformed me from someone who delivered speeches to someone who facilitated conversations. Even when I was the only one talking, I was constantly responding to the nonverbal feedback I was receiving. The audience became my co-creator in every presentation. The worksheet I developed that day became the foundation for thousands of successful speaking engagements. It reminded me to research their industry, understand their challenges, identify their decision makers, and prepare for their likely objections. But more than that, it trained me to see every audience as a collection of individual human beings, each with their own hopes, fears, and motivations. This approach revolutionized not just my speaking, but my entire approach to human interaction. I learned that true persuasion begins not with your message, but with your understanding of the people you're trying to reach. Asterisk, I was analyzing Winston Churchill's "We shall fight on the beaches" speech when I discovered the secret that separates memorable speakers from forgettable ones. It wasn't Churchill's famous peroration that caught my attention, it was his opening paragraph, the words that hooked a desperate nation and changed the course of World War II. Most people remember Churchill's defiant ending, "We shall never surrender," but I became obsessed with how he began. "I have, myself, full confidence that if all do their duty, if nothing is neglected, and if the best arrangements are made, as they are being made, we shall prove ourselves once again able to defend our island home." In those first 30 seconds, Churchill accomplished something that most speakers never achieve in 30 minutes. He didn't begin with statistics about German military strength or detailed analysis of military strategy. Instead, he immediately positioned his audience, the British people, as capable defenders of their homeland. He made them the heroes of the story before he even told them what the story was about. This taught me the fundamental truth about compelling openings. The first 30 seconds don't determine whether people will listen to your entire speech. They determine whether people will listen to your next sentence. And if they don't listen to your next sentence, nothing else matters. I began studying the openings of every great speech I could find, and I discovered 5 types of beginnings that never fail to capture attention. Each one works because it immediately connects with something the audience already cares about deeply. The first type is the personal story opening. This is where you begin with a moment from your own experience that illustrates the challenge or opportunity you're addressing. The key is vulnerability share, a moment when you struggled with exactly what your audience is struggling with. When I opened speeches by talking about my trembling hands before my first presentation, audiences immediately leaned in because they recognized their own fear. The second type is the startling fact opening. But here's what most people get wrong. The fact must be startling to your specific audience, not just generally interesting. When I told groups of business leaders that the average executive spends 23% of their time in meetings where nothing meaningful gets accomplished, they sat up because that statistic hit close to home. The third type is the question opening, but it must be a question that forces people to examine their own situation. Not how many of you want to be successful, but how many of you have ever had a brilliant idea that died because you couldn't communicate it effectively. The first question gets polite hand-raising. The second gets internal reflection. The fourth type is the quote opening, using someone else's words to frame your message. But the quote must be unexpected or familiar words used in an unexpected way. Churchill often quoted his opponents, then systematically dismantled their logic. This technique borrows credibility while setting up your counterargument. The fifth type is the vision opening, where you immediately paint a picture of what's possible. Martin Luther King Jr. mastered this technique. He didn't begin "I have a dream" by discussing the problems with segregation. He began by envisioning an America where his children would be judged by character rather than color. But regardless of which type you choose, every compelling opening must accomplish 3 critical tasks within the first minute. First, it must grab attention by addressing something your audience already cares about. Second, it must establish credibility by demonstrating that you understand their situation. Third, it must create anticipation by promising value they can't get anywhere else. I learned this the hard way during a presentation to a group of skeptical sales managers. I had planned to open with industry statistics, but as I looked out at their tired, cynical faces, I realized they had heard every sales technique and statistic imaginable. Instead, I began, "Yesterday, I watched a salesman lose a sure thing by making one simple mistake that every person in this room has made at least once." The room went dead silent. Every head turned toward me. I had their complete attention because I had promised to reveal a mistake they had personally made and, more importantly, how to avoid making it again. Churchill understood this principle intuitively. He knew that the British people in June 1940 were terrified, exhausted, and beginning to doubt whether they could survive against overwhelming odds. His opening didn't deny their fear or minimize their challenges. Instead, it reframed their situation. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. He took their fear and transformed it into purpose. He took their isolation and transformed it into heroic opportunity. In 30 seconds, he changed a nation's emotional state from despair to determination. The most powerful technique I discovered was what I called the future memory opening. This is where you begin by describing a moment in the future when your audience will be glad they learned what you're about to teach them. 6 months from now, you'll look back on this moment as the day you finally learned how to turn your ideas into influence. This technique works because it helps people see themselves succeeding before you even begin teaching them how to succeed. It creates emotional investment in the outcome before they've heard the method. I also learned that the worst openings are the ones that focus on the speaker instead of the audience. Never begin with your credentials, your agenda, or your appreciation for being invited to speak. These might be polite, but they're not compelling. Your audience doesn't care about you, yet they care about themselves and their problems. The opening sets the emotional tone for everything that follows. If you begin with energy, you give yourself permission to be energetic throughout. If you begin with vulnerability, you create space for authentic connection. If you begin with curiosity, you engage people's natural desire to learn and grow. Master the opening, and you've won half the battle. Fumble the opening, and you'll spend the rest of your time trying to recover attention you never fully captured in the first place. Asterisk. The breakthrough that revolutionized my understanding of persuasive arguments came when I developed what I called the 3-point persuasion formula. I had been struggling to help my students structure their presentations in a way that naturally led audiences toward agreement. When I realized that most people were building their arguments backwards, traditional logic teaches us to present evidence first, then draw conclusions. But human psychology works in reverse. People need to understand the problem before they care about the solution. They need to feel the pain before they'll invest in the remedy. They need to see what's at stake before they'll take action. This insight led me to develop a framework that I've seen work countless times. Problem, agitation, solution. But the real power isn't in the formula itself. It's in understanding why each element must build inevitably toward the next. The problem phase isn't just about identifying what's wrong. It's about helping your audience recognize a problem they might not have fully articulated themselves. The most persuasive problems are the ones people sense but haven't named. When you give language to their frustration, you immediately establish credibility and connection. I learnt this while working with a group of managers who were struggling with employee motivation. Instead of jumping straight into motivation techniques, I began by describing the daily frustration of watching capable people perform at half their potential. I painted a picture of the energy drain of constantly having to push, prod, and micromanage adults who should be self-directed. I described this problem. I watched heads nod around the room. I wasn't telling them anything they didn't already know, but I was helping them see their situation more clearly. That's the power of effective problem identification. It creates a shared understanding of what needs to change. The agitation phase is where most speakers go wrong. They think agitation means making people upset or uncomfortable. But true agitation is about helping people understand the full cost of leaving the problem unsolved. It's about painting a picture of what happens if nothing changes. What I discovered is that people have an amazing ability to tolerate problems until they understand the true cost of those problems. A manager might accept low team performance until they realize it's costing them promotions. A salesperson might accept poor closing ratios until they calculate how much money they're leaving on the table. Effective agitation isn't illumination. You're helping people see consequences they might not have considered. But here's the crucial part. You must agitate the problem, not the person. You want them to feel uncomfortable with their situation, not uncomfortable with themselves. The solution phase is where you provide the bridge from problem to resolution. But the solution must feel inevitable, not surprising. If you've properly identified the problem and effectively agitated it, your audience should almost be able to predict your solution before you present it. I learned to test this by asking myself, if I stopped speaking right now, would my audience be able to guess what I'm about to recommend? If the answer was no, I knew I hadn't built sufficient foundation in the first two phases. But there's another crucial element that most speakers miss entirely. Facts alone never change minds. People don't make decisions based on data, they make decisions based on what the data means to them personally. Your job isn't to present facts, it's to translate facts into personal significance. When I taught this principle, I would demonstrate it by sharing two versions of the same information. First, I would say, poor communication costs American businesses $62 billion annually. Then I would say, poor communication is costing your company roughly $10,000 per employee every year, money that could be going toward raises, bonuses, or profit sharing. Same fact, but the second version helps people feel the personal impact. The first is just a number. The second is a lost opportunity they can visualize. I also discovered the incredible power of the rule of three in human psychology. People remember things in groups of three. Think about it. Stop, look, and listen. Blood, sweat, and tears. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's something about three elements that feels complete and memorable to the human mind. When I structured my arguments around three main points, audience retention improved dramatically. But I learned that the 3 points must follow a logical progression. The first point should establish credibility, the second should build momentum, and the third should drive toward action. The architecture of persuasion also requires what I call transition bridges, clear connections between each element that help your audience follow your logical progression. These bridges aren't just helpful, they're essential. Without them, even the best individual points feel disconnected and random. I learned to use phrases like "this leads us to an even more important consideration," or "but knowing this creates a new challenge." These transitions signal to your audience that you're building towards something significant, not just sharing random information. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that making complex ideas simple is a far greater skill than making simple ideas complex. The most persuasive arguments are the ones that take complicated situations and provide clear, actionable frameworks for understanding and addressing them. When I could take a complex business challenge and distill it down to 3 clear choices, each with obvious consequences, decision-making became much easier for my audience. I wasn't overwhelming them with options. I was providing them with clarity. The ultimate test of any argument is this: after hearing it, does your audience feel more confused or more confident about what to do next? Great arguments don't just inform, they empower. They don't just explain problems, they illuminate pathways to solutions. This formula became the foundation for every persuasive presentation I would ever give. Problem, agitation, solution, but delivered with personal relevance, emotional connection, and crystal clear simplicity. Asterisk, asterisk, a single letter changed my entire understanding of what it means to truly connect with an audience. It arrived 3 months after I had spoken to a group of struggling entrepreneurs in Chicago. The envelope was worn, as if it had been carried around for weeks before being mailed. Inside, a woman named Margaret wrote, "Mr. Carnegie, I need you to know that your story about failure wasn't just words to me. When you talked about losing your first business and feeling like a complete fraud, I realized I wasn't alone. For the first time in months, I felt like someone understood." That night, I went home and finally told my husband the truth about our financial situation. "Your vulnerability gave me permission to be vulnerable too." This letter taught me something that would reshape my entire approach to speaking. Vulnerability isn't weakness, it's the fastest path to connection. When you share your struggles, you don't diminish your credibility, you increase your humanity. And people connect with humans, not heroes. Asterisk, I began studying the neuroscience behind emotional decision-making, and what I discovered revolutionized my understanding of persuasion. The human brain makes decisions emotionally first, then uses logic to justify those emotional decisions. This isn't a flaw in human thinking, it's how we're designed to survive and thrive. When someone hears facts and figures, the information goes to their neocortex, the rational thinking part of their brain. But when someone hears a story or experiences an emotion, that information goes to their limbic system, the part that actually drives behavior. If you want to change how people act, you must first change how they feel. This understanding led me to develop what I called the vulnerability technique. Instead of trying to impress audiences with my successes, I began sharing my struggles and failures. Instead of positioning myself as the expert with all the answers, I presented myself as a fellow traveler who had learned some valuable lessons along the way. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. When I spoke about my early failures in business, audiences leaned forward instead of sitting back. When I admitted my fears and insecurities, people nodded in recognition instead of polite acknowledgement. When I shared my mistakes, they saw me as authentic instead of arrogant. But I learned that vulnerability must be strategic, not self-indulgent. The goal isn't to make yourself look bad. It's to make your audience feel understood. You share your struggles not to gain sympathy, but to build bridges to universal human experiences. I developed a simple test for whether a vulnerable story was appropriate. Does this help my audience feel less alone in their struggle? If the answer was yes, I shared it. If it was just about making me look humble or getting attention, I kept it to myself. I also discovered that emotional connection isn't just about sharing feelings. It's about creating shared experiences. When you can help your audience feel what you felt, think what you thought, and see what you saw, you create a bond that facts alone never could. This led me to master the art of emotional storytelling. I learned to use specific details that engage the senses. Instead of saying I was nervous, I would say my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my notes, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool morning air. These sensory details help people experience your story, not just hear it. When you engage someone's senses, you activate their empathy. They don't just understand what happened to you, they feel it themselves. I also learned to identify and speak to the emotions beneath the surface. When people asked for time management techniques, they were often expressing anxiety about being overwhelmed. When they requested leadership advice, they frequently felt insecure about their ability to influence others. When they wanted sales strategies, they were sometimes dealing with fear of rejection. By addressing the emotional subtext, not just the surface request, I could create deeper connection and more lasting change. I wasn't just giving them techniques, I was acknowledging their human experience and providing emotional as well as practical support. One of the most powerful techniques I developed was what I called emotional validation. This is where you acknowledge and normalize the feelings your audience is experiencing before you try to change their thinking or behavior. Instead of jumping straight into solutions, I would say things like, if you're feeling overwhelmed by all the demands on your time, you're not weak, you're human. Every successful person I've ever met has felt exactly the same way. This validation created psychological safety that made people more open to learning and change. I discovered that people must feel heard before they can hear you. When you acknowledge their emotions, their struggles, and their fears, you earn the right to offer them hope, direction, and solutions. The breakthrough moment came when I realized that emotional connection isn't about making people emotional, it's about making them feel understood. When people feel truly seen and acknowledged, they naturally become more open to new ideas and possibilities. This principle transformed not just my speaking, but every relationship in my life. I learned that before you can move people, you must meet them where they are. Before you can inspire them to change, you must connect with who they are right now. Margaret's letter reminded me that behind every audience is a collection of individual human beings, each carrying their own fears, hopes, dreams, and struggles. When you speak to their hearts first, their minds naturally follow. When you connect with their emotions first, their logic becomes your ally instead of your opponent. The secret of emotional connection isn't manipulation, it's recognition. You're not trying to create emotions that don't exist. You're acknowledging emotions that are already there. and helping people understand that they're not alone in feeling them. Asterisk, asterisk. Mark Twain's speaking notes revealed a secret that revolutionized my understanding of persuasive storytelling. I had acquired these precious documents during my research into America's greatest speakers, and what I found scribbled in the margins changed everything I thought I knew about the power of narrative. Twain hadn't just written stories, he had engineered them. Every anecdote, every humorous aside, every seemingly casual observation was carefully crafted to serve a specific persuasive purpose. He understood something that most speakers miss entirely. Stories don't just illustrate points, they bypass mental resistance and deliver truth directly to the heart. The revelation came when I noticed how Twain structured what appeared to be a simple, rambling story about a frog jumping contest. On the surface, it was pure entertainment, but underneath, it was a sophisticated lesson about the dangers of misplaced confidence. The humor disarmed his audience's analytical defenses, allowing the deeper message to penetrate without resistance. This discovery led me to understand why stories are the most powerful tool in the persuader's arsenal. When someone hears an argument, their brain immediately begins looking for flaws, exceptions, and counterpoints. But when someone hears a story, their brain becomes absorbed in the narrative, following the characters and rooting for resolution. Stories work because they engage our emotions first and our logic second. When we're caught up in a narrative, we stop analyzing and start experiencing. We don't judge the characters, we identify with them. We don't critique the plot, we follow it to its conclusion. I began studying the anatomy of persuasive stories, and I discovered that every effective narrative follows the same basic structure: setup, conflict, resolution, and lesson. But the magic happens in how you craft each element to serve your persuasive purpose. The setup introduces characters and context that your audience can identify with. This isn't just background information, it's an invitation for your listeners to see themselves in the story. When I told stories about nervous speakers, I always described them as intelligent, well-meaning people who simply lacked confidence. My audience could see themselves in these characters without feeling judged or diminished. The conflict is where you introduce the challenge, obstacle, or problem that drives the narrative forward. But here's what most people miss: the conflict in your story should mirror the conflict your audience is experiencing. If you're speaking to managers struggling with team motivation, your story's conflict should involve someone trying to inspire and engage others. The resolution shows how the character overcame the challenge or learned from the failure. This isn't just the ending of your story, it's the preview of what's possible for your audience. When they see how your character succeeded, they begin to believe that similar success is possible for them. The lesson is where you make the connection explicit between your story and their situation. This is your opportunity to translate the narrative into actionable insight, but the lesson must feel inevitable, not forced. If you've crafted your story well, your audience should almost be able to predict the lesson before you state it. Twain mastered this structure in ways that seemed effortless, but were actually meticulous. His story about the jumping frog appeared to be about gambling and small-town humor, but it was really about the danger of underestimating others, lesson his audience of business leaders needed to hear. I learned to use what I called embedded stories, narratives that contained multiple layers of meaning. On the surface, they entertained and engaged, but underneath, they delivered powerful lessons about human nature, business principles, or personal development. The most effective technique I discovered was the personal transformation story. This is where you share a specific moment when you learned something important, made a crucial mistake, or experienced a significant breakthrough. These stories work because they show rather than tell. Instead of saying persistence is important, you tell a story about a time when you almost gave up but pushed through and succeeded. but I learned that personal stories must be carefully chosen and expertly crafted. The goal isn't to make yourself look good, it's to make your lesson memorable and actionable. Sometimes the most powerful personal stories are about your failures, not your successes. I also discovered the incredible power of future stories, narratives that help your audience visualize themselves succeeding. Instead of just telling them what to do, you paint a picture of what success will look and feel like. You help them experience the future they could create if they apply what you're teaching. Humor became another essential element in my storytelling arsenal. But I learned that humor in persuasive speaking isn't about getting laughs, it's about creating connection and diffusing resistance. When people laugh with you, they lower their psychological defenses. When they're enjoying themselves, they become more open to new ideas. Twain understood this intuitively. His humor wasn't just entertaining, it was strategic. He used it to make serious points more palatable, to build rapport with skeptical audiences, and to make complex ideas more memorable. A lesson wrapped in laughter sticks in the mind far longer than one delivered in serious prose. I learned to collect stories the way other people collect stamps. Every interaction, every experience, every conversation became potential material for future presentations. I kept a journal of interesting anecdotes, compelling examples, and powerful metaphors that I could adapt for different audiences and purposes. But the most important lesson I learned about storytelling came from watching my students transform. When they stopped trying to impress their audiences with credentials and expertise, and started connecting through shared human experiences, their persuasive power increased exponentially. Stories level the playing field between speaker and audience. They create a sense of shared humanity that facts and figures never could. When you tell a story about your struggles, your audience doesn't see you as an expert lecturing from above. They see you as a fellow traveler sharing wisdom from the journey. The ultimate test of any story is this: does it help your audience see themselves, their situation, or their possibilities more clearly? If it does, it's not just entertainment, it's transformation. If it doesn't, it's just noise. No matter how well crafted or beautifully delivered, Twain's genius wasn't just in his wit or his timing, it was in his understanding that the best stories don't just hold a mirror to human nature, they hold a window to human potential. Asterisk, asterisk, the most hostile audience I ever faced taught me that resistance isn't your enemy, it's your opportunity. I was speaking to a group of union leaders in Detroit who had been forced to attend my presentation on workplace cooperation. They sat with arms crossed, faces skeptical, clearly viewing me as management's latest attempt to manipulate them into compliance. 15 minutes into my prepared remarks, one man in the back row stood up and said, "Mr. Carnegie, with all due respect, you don't understand what it's like to work in these factories. Your pretty theories don't apply to our reality." The room went dead silent, waiting to see how I would respond to this direct challenge. In that moment, I made a decision that changed my entire approach to handling objections. Instead of defending my position or dismissing his concern, I said, "You're absolutely right. I don't understand your reality, and I should have started by asking you to help me understand it. Would you mind sharing what I'm missing?" What happened next surprised everyone in the room, including me. The man began describing the daily frustrations and challenges he faced. Other people started adding their perspectives. Within 20 minutes, we had identified the real issues that needed to be addressed, issues that weren't in my prepared presentation but were at the heart of their resistance. This experience taught me to develop what I called my objection anticipation map, a strategic framework for predicting, preparing for, and transforming resistance into engagement. I learned that objections aren't obstacles to overcome. They're information to understand and address, the first principle of handling Resistance is to recognize that objections are rarely about your content. They're about trust, relevance, or fear. When someone says that won't work in our industry, they're often saying, I don't trust that you understand my situation. When someone says we've tried that before, they're usually expressing fear of another disappointment. I developed what I call the Aikido approach to objections. In martial arts, Aikido teaches you to redirect an opponent's energy rather than resist it directly. The same principle applies to handling resistance in speaking. Instead of fighting objections head-on, you acknowledge them, explore them, and redirect them toward productive dialogue. The most powerful phrase I learned for handling objections is, "That's an important point. Help me understand, ... This response does three crucial things simultaneously. First, it validates the person's concern without agreeing or disagreeing. Second, it demonstrates genuine curiosity rather than defensiveness. Third, it turns the objection into a conversation rather than a confrontation. I also discovered the power of preemption, addressing likely objections before they're raised. This technique works because it demonstrates that you've thought deeply about potential problems and have considered alternative perspectives. When you acknowledge weaknesses in your own argument before others point them out, you actually increase your credibility rather than diminish it. But preemption must be done skillfully. You can't just list every possible objection that would undermine confidence in your message. Instead, you acknowledge the most likely concerns and show how you've accounted for them in your recommendations. The breakthrough came when I realized that resistance often signals engagement, not rejection. When people object to your ideas, it means they're thinking about them seriously enough to identify potential problems. Apathy is far more dangerous than resistance, because at least resistance gives you something to work with. I learned to listen for the emotion behind the objection. Fear often sounds like skepticism. Frustration often sounds like anger. Past disappointment often sounds like cynicism. When you address the emotion rather than just the logical content of the objection, you can often transform resistance into alliance. One of the most effective techniques I developed was what I called objection reframing. This is where you help people see their concerns from a different perspective. For example, when someone says this is too risky, you might respond with your right to be concerned about risk. What would help you feel more confident about managing that risk? This approach acknowledges their concern while shifting the conversation from whether to proceed to how to proceed safely. You're not dismissing their objection, you're building on it to find a mutually acceptable solution. I also learned the importance of distinguishing between genuine objections and reflexive resistance. Genuine objections are based on real concerns that need to be addressed. Reflexive resistance is often just habitual negativity or fear of change. The two require completely different responses. For genuine objections, you need to provide information, address concerns, and sometimes modify your recommendation. For reflexive resistance, you need to create small wins that build confidence and momentum. You can't logic someone out of an emotional position. You have to give them emotional reasons to reconsider. The most challenging situation I learned to handle was group resistance, when an entire audience seems opposed to your message. In these situations, I developed a technique called finding the bridge person. This is someone in the group who might be more open to your ideas and can help influence others. Sometimes the bridge person is obvious. They ask thoughtful questions or nod along with certain points. Sometimes you have to create them by asking questions that help people reflect on their own experiences rather than defending their positions. I discovered that the worst thing you can do when facing resistance is to become defensive or argumentative. When you fight objections, you often strengthen them. When you explore objections with genuine curiosity, you often dissolve them. The ultimate goal isn't to eliminate all objections, to create an environment where concerns can be raised, discussed, and addressed constructively. Some of my most successful presentations were the ones where we spent significant time working through objections together. This collaborative approach transforms you from an adversary trying to convince people to an ally helping them solve problems. When people feel heard and understood, they become much more open to considering new perspectives and possibilities. The lesson that hostile audience in Detroit taught me was invaluable. Resistance isn't a sign that you're failing, it's a sign that you're dealing with something important enough for people to care about. Your job isn't to eliminate that caring. It's to channel it toward productive outcomes. The first time I heard Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speak, I understood something about the rhythm of persuasion that changed my entire approach to delivery. It wasn't just his words that moved the audience. It was the musical way he delivered them. His speech had rhythm, tempo, crescendos, and strategic silences that created an almost hypnotic effect. I began analyzing King's "I Have a Dream" speech with the precision of a conductor studying a symphony. What I discovered was that great persuasive speaking isn't just about what you say, it's about the rhythm and flow of how you say it. The most powerful speakers understand that human attention has natural cycles, and they structure their delivery to work with these rhythms rather than against them. King's mastery became evident when I mapped out the pacing of his most famous speech. He began slowly and deliberately, drawing people in with measured phrases. Then he built momentum through repetition and variation, creating waves of energy that carried his audience forward. The famous "I Have a Dream" section wasn't just inspirational content. It was a rhythmic crescendo that made the emotional impact inevitable. This analysis led me to understand that persuasive speaking is fundamentally musical in nature, just as music creates emotional states through rhythm, tempo, and dynamics. Effective speaking uses similar techniques to guide an audience's emotional journey. I learned to think of every speech as having movements, like a symphony. The opening movement establishes the theme and captures attention. The development section builds complexity and depth. The climactic movement creates emotional peak, and the resolution brings everything together in a satisfying conclusion. But the real breakthrough came when I understood the power of strategic pauses. In music, the spaces between notes are as important as the notes themselves. In speaking, the silences between words can be more powerful than the words themselves. I began experimenting with different types of pauses and discovered that each serves a specific purpose. The dramatic pause creates suspense and emphasizes important points. The reflective pause gives your audience time to absorb complex ideas. The transitional pause signals that you're moving from one concept to another. The emotional pause allows feelings to settle and deepen. King was a master of the dramatic pause. Before delivering his most powerful lines, he would stop speaking entirely, letting anticipation build in the room. This wasn't accidentally, was strategic. He understood that silence commands attention in a way that continuous speaking never could. I also learned about the hypnotic power of repetition when used skillfully. King's "I Have a Dream" refrain wasn't just poetic, it was psychologically strategic. Repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity creates acceptance. When you repeat key phrases or concepts throughout your presentation, you're programming them into your audience's memory. But repetition must be varied to remain powerful. King didn't just repeat "I have a dream," he followed it with different visions each time, creating a pattern that was both predictable and surprising. This technique keeps people engaged while reinforcing your central message. The rhythm of persuasion also involves understanding energy management, both yours and your audience's. Human attention naturally fluctuates in cycles of approximately 7 to 10 minutes. Great speakers work with these cycles, providing intensity followed by reflection, complexity followed by simplicity, emotion followed by logic. I developed what I called the energy wave approach to structuring presentations. I would build energy through stories, examples, and emotional content, then provide release through summaries, reflection, or quieter moments. This rhythmic pattern prevents audience fatigue while maintaining engagement throughout longer presentations. Also discovered the power of vocal variety in creating persuasive rhythm. Changes in volume, pitch, and pace signal importance and create interest. A sudden whisper can be more attention-grabbing than a shout. A rapid-fire delivery can create excitement, while a slow, deliberate pace can emphasize gravity. King demonstrated this beautifully in his delivery. He would build 2 passionate crescendos, then drop 2 intimate whispers. He would race through some passages to create momentum, then slow down dramatically to emphasize crucial points. His voice was an instrument that he played with masterful skill, but perhaps the most important aspect of rhythmic speaking is authenticity. You can't manufacture rhythm artificially, must grow naturally from your genuine passion for your message. When you truly care about what you're saying, rhythm emerges naturally from that caring. I learned to let my natural speaking patterns emerge, while consciously enhancing them for maximum impact. This meant becoming aware of my tendency to speed up when nervous and learning to slow down for emphasis. It meant recognizing when my voice became monotone and injecting purposeful variety. The breathing technique became crucial for maintaining both rhythm and energy. Proper breathing supports vocal power and provides natural pause points. I taught my students to breathe not just for vocal support, but as a timing mechanism that creates natural rhythm in their delivery. I also discovered that physical movement contributes to speaking rhythm. Strategic gestures, purposeful movement, and intentional stillness all contribute to the overall flow of your presentation. Like a conductor leading an orchestra, your physical presence should guide your audience through the emotional journey of your message. The ultimate test of rhythmic speaking is this: does your delivery enhance your message or distract from it? When rhythm serves content, it becomes invisible but powerful. When rhythm becomes the focus, it undermines the very message it's supposed to support. King's genius wasn't just in his vision or his words. It was in his understanding that how you say something is often as important as what you say. The rhythm of his delivery didn't just carry his words, it carried his audience to a place where those words could transform hearts and change history. Learning to speak with rhythm and flow transformed my effectiveness as a communicator. It taught me that persuasion isn't just about logical arguments or emotional appeals. It's about creating an experience that guides your audience naturally toward the conclusions you want them to reach. Asterisk. Theodore Roosevelt changed my understanding of physical presence forever. I had the privilege of observing him speak on several occasions, and what struck me wasn't just his powerful voice or compelling content, it was the way he commanded attention before he ever opened his mouth. Roosevelt understood something that most speakers never learn. Your body speaks before your voice does. I began studying Roosevelt's documented techniques and discovered that he had developed what amounted to a systematic approach to persuasive body language. Every gesture, every stance, every movement was purposeful and strategic. He had learned to use his physical presence as an extension of his message, not just a vehicle for delivering it. The first principle Roosevelt mastered was what I call the stance of authority and approachability. Most speakers make the mistake of trying to look either authoritative or approachable, but not both. Roosevelt understood that true leadership requires both qualities simultaneously. His stance was grounded and stable, feet shoulder-width apart, weight evenly distributed, shoulders back but not rigid. This communicated strength and confidence, but his facial expression remained open and engaged. His eyes connected with individuals throughout the audience, and his overall demeanor invited connection rather than commanded distance. I learned to teach this balance to my students by having them imagine they were greeting a respected friend they hadn't seen in years. This mental image naturally creates the perfect combination of confidence and warmth that effective speakers need. Roosevelt's gesture techniques were particularly masterful. He understood that gestures must feel natural and purposeful, never theatrical or contrived. His movements supported his words rather than competing with them for attention. When he pointed, it was to direct attention to an important idea. When he opened his arms, it was to embrace a concept or include his audience in his vision. I discovered that effective gestures follow the same principle as effective words. They must be authentic to be powerful. Roosevelt's gestures grew naturally from his genuine passion for his subjects. When speakers try to add gestures artificially, they look mechanical and distracting. The breakthrough came when I understood that 55% of communication is nonverbal. This means that more than half of your persuasive impact comes not from what you say, but from how you look when you say it. Your body language is either supporting your message or undermining if there's no neutral ground. Roosevelt's eye contact patterns were particularly sophisticated. He didn't just look at his audience, he connected with individuals throughout the room, holding each person's gaze just long enough to create a sense of personal conversation. This technique made everyone feel like he was speaking directly to them, even in crowds of thousands. I learned to teach speakers to think of eye contact as a conversation with individuals rather than a performance for a group. When you focus on connecting with one person at a time, your eye contact becomes natural and engaging rather than scanning and superficial. The management of nervous and energy became another crucial element. Roosevelt had learned to channel his natural intensity into purposeful movement rather than letting it manifest as distracting fidgeting. He would walk deliberately across the platform, pause strategically, and use the space around him to emphasize different points. I discovered that nervous energy isn't something to eliminate, it's something to harness. When speakers try to suppress their energy, they often become stiff and lifeless. When they learn to channel that energy into purposeful movement and gestures, they become dynamic and engaging. Roosevelt's facial expressions were a study in authentic communication. His face reflected his genuine feelings about his subject matter. When he discussed serious issues, his expression was appropriately grave. When he shared optimistic visions, his face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. This congruence between content and expression created trust and believability. I learned that facial authenticity can't be faked effectively. The best approach is to genuinely care about your subject matter and let that caring show naturally in your expressions. When you're truly passionate about your message, your face will automatically reflect that passion in ways that no acting technique can replicate. The use of space became another Roosevelt signature. He understood that the physical space around a speaker communicates as much as the speaker themselves. He would move closer to his audience during intimate moments and step back during more formal sections. He used the entire platform as a canvas for his message. I taught my students to think of their speaking space as a tool for emphasis and connection. Moving toward your audience creates intimacy and urgency. Moving back creates perspective and formality. Strategic positioning can reinforce your verbal message in powerful ways. Roosevelt also mastered what I call stillness with purpose. He understood that constant movement dilutes impact, while strategic stillness commands attention. During his most important points, he would become completely still, focusing all attention on his words rather than his movement. This principle of purposeful stillness became crucial in my teaching. Many speakers move constantly because they're nervous, but this movement becomes a distraction from their message. Learning when to be still is as important as learning when to move. The integration of posture, gesture, movement, and expression must appear effortless, even though it requires careful attention. Roosevelt spent years developing his platform presence, but the result looked completely natural. The best physical presence is the kind that enhances your message without calling attention to itself. I discovered that authentic body language comes from alignment between your inner state and your outer expression. When you genuinely believe in your message and care about your audience, your body language naturally supports your words. When you're uncertain about your content or disconnected from your purpose, your body language betrays that uncertainty. The ultimate goal isn't to become a polished performer, to become a more authentic and effective communicator. Roosevelt's power came not from perfected techniques, but from the genuine conviction that animated those techniques. His body language was compelling because it was the natural expression of a man who deeply believed in what he was saying. This understanding transformed how I approached physical presence in speaking. Instead of trying to learn perfect techniques, I focused on developing genuine passion for my message and letting that passion express itself naturally through my physical presence. The techniques became tools for enhancing authenticity rather than replacing it. Franklin D. Roosevelt's voice training notes revealed secrets that revolutionized my understanding of vocal persuasion. When radio emerged as the dominant communication medium, Roosevelt recognized that his political survival depended on mastering this intimate new format. The techniques he developed to reach millions of Americans through their radios taught me that voice is not just how you deliver your message, is your message. I studied Roosevelt's transformation from a politician who spoke to crowds to a leader who conversed with individuals through radio waves. The shift required him to completely reimagine how voice could create connection, trust, and influence. His fireside chats weren't just heard, they were felt by families gathered around radios across America. Roosevelt understood that radio created unprecedented intimacy between speaker and listener. Unlike platform speaking, where physical presence and gestures could support the message, radio stripped communication down to pure voice. This limitation became his greatest opportunity to master the subtle art of vocal persuasion. The first principle Roosevelt mastered was vocal warmth. He learned to smile while speaking, understanding that facial expressions affect vocal tone even when the audience can't see your face. This technique, which I came to call vocal smiling, transforms the quality of your voice from mechanical delivery to human connection. I began teaching my students to record themselves, speaking the same content with and without smiling. The difference was remarkable. The smiling voice carried warmth, approachability, and sincerity that the neutral voice lacked. This simple technique could transform even technical content into engaging communication. Roosevelt's breathing techniques were particularly sophisticated. He understood that voice is breath made audible, and that proper breathing supports not just vocal power, but emotional authenticity. His training notes revealed exercises for developing diaphragmatic breathing that provided sustained vocal energy without strain. I learned that most speakers breathe from their chest when nervous, creating thin, weak voices that betray their anxiety. Roosevelt trained himself to breathe from his diaphragm even under pressure, maintaining vocal authority and calm regardless of the situation. This breathing technique became fundamental to my teaching. The concept of vocal variety emerged as Roosevelt's greatest strength. He understood that monotone delivery, regardless of content quality, loses audience attention within minutes. His fireside chats were masterpieces of vocal variety changes in pace, pitch, volume, and inflection that kept millions engaged for 30 minutes or more. I analyzed recordings of Roosevelt's speeches and discovered patterns in his vocal variety. He would slow down for emphasis, speed up to create momentum, lower his voice for intimacy, and raise it for inspiration. These changes weren't random, they served specific persuasive purposes. The power of strategic whispers became one of my most effective teaching techniques. Roosevelt discovered that suddenly dropping to a near whisper commanded more attention than shouting. When you whisper, people must lean in both physically and mentally to hear you. This technique creates immediate intimacy and focuses attention. Like a spotlight, I began incorporating whisper techniques into my own speaking and teaching others to use them strategically. A whispered confession, a quiet revelation, or an intimate observation often carries more impact than the most passionate declaration. The whisper says, "This is just between us," creating a sense of exclusive connection. Roosevelt's pace variations were equally strategic. He would use rapid delivery to create excitement and energy, particularly when discussing action steps or urgent needs. Then he would slow dramatically for his most important points, letting each word carry full weight. This rhythmic variation kept his audience engaged and emphasized his key messages. I learned that pace is one of the most underutilized tools in vocal persuasion. Most speakers settle into a comfortable rhythm and maintain it throughout their presentation. But comfort for the speaker often means boredom for the audience. Strategic pace changes signal importance and maintain attention. The technique of vocal pausing became another Roosevelt's signature. He understood that strategic silence could be more powerful than words. His pauses weren't hesitations, they were deliberate tools for emphasis, reflection, and dramatic impact. He would pause before important announcements, after significant statements, and during emotional moments. I discovered that most speakers are uncomfortable with silence, rushing to fill every moment with words. But Roosevelt taught me that pauses give your audience time to absorb, reflect, and internalize your message. The pause is where persuasion often happens, in the silence that follows your words. Roosevelt's inflection patterns revealed another layer of vocal sophistication. He would raise his pitch slightly at the end of statements to create engagement, as if inviting agreement. He would lower his pitch for statements of fact, communicating certainty and authority. These subtle inflection changes guided his audience's emotional responses. Volume control became another crucial element. Roosevelt never shouted to show passion. He used volume strategically for emphasis and emotional impact. A sudden increase in volume could highlight urgency, while a drop in volume could create intimacy or gravity. His volume changes always served his message, never overwhelming it. I began teaching speakers to think of their voice as a musical instrument, with multiple settings and capabilities. Just as a pianist uses the full range of keys to create emotional impact, speakers must use the full range of their vocal capabilities to maximize persuasive power. The breathing exercises Roosevelt developed became foundational to my voice training. Proper breath support allows for sustained vocal power, clear articulation, and emotional authenticity. When speakers run out of breath, they lose vocal authority and often rush their delivery to compensate. I learned to teach diaphragmatic breathing, not just as a vocal technique, but as a confidence builder. When you can rely on your breath support, you feel more secure and authoritative. This internal confidence translates into external vocal power. Roosevelt's articulation work was equally important. He understood that unclear speech undermines credibility and understanding. His exercises focused on crisp consonants and clear vowels that would transmit effectively through radio, technology, and create understanding even in challenging listening conditions. The ultimate lesson from Roosevelt's vocal mastery was that voice work isn't about developing a perfect speaking voice, is about developing authentic vocal expression that serves your message and connects with your audience. His voice wasn't naturally perfect, but he made it an effective instrument for leadership and persuasion. I realized that every speaker's voice is unique, and the goal isn't to sound like someone else, but to sound like the best version of yourself. Roosevelt's techniques weren't about changing his fundamental voice. They were about maximizing the persuasive potential of the voice he had. The worst speaking disaster of my career taught me the most valuable lesson about handling difficult audiences. I was invited to address a group of steelworkers in Pittsburgh during a particularly contentious labor dispute. The audience was angry, suspicious, and openly hostile before I ever took the stage. They saw me as another management consultant hired to manipulate them into accepting poor working conditions. My carefully prepared presentation about workplace cooperation lasted exactly 12 minutes before someone in the back shouted, "Enough of this garbage. You don't know what it's like to work in these conditions." The room erupted in agreement, and I stood frozen, watching my presentation crumble before my eyes. In that moment of crisis, I made a decision that seemed like surrender, but turned out to be salvation. I stopped trying to deliver my prepared remarks and said, "You're absolutely right. I don't know what it's like, and I should have started by asking you to teach me. Would you be willing to help me understand your situation?" What happened next was extraordinary. The angry man who had interrupted began describing the dangerous working conditions, the impossible production quotas, and the treatment he and his colleagues endured. Other workers joined in, sharing their experiences and frustrations. Instead of hostility, I found myself witnessing profound humanity. This experience led me to develop what I called my hostile audience recovery plan, a systematic approach to transforming adversarial situations into collaborative conversations. The foundation of this approach is understanding that hostility usually masks hurt, fear, or frustration. When you address the underlying emotion instead of fighting the surface hostility, transformation becomes possible. I learned that the anatomy of audience hostility follows predictable patterns. Hostile audiences typically result from previous disappointments, perceived betrayals, or fundamental disagreements about values or priorities. Understanding the source of hostility is crucial to addressing it effectively. The first technique I developed was what I call the acknowledgement bridge. Instead of defending yourself or your position when faced with hostility, you acknowledge the audience's right to feel the way they do. This doesn't mean agreeing with everything they say, but it does mean validating their experience and emotions. When that steelworker challenged me, I could have defended my credentials or insisted on the value of my message. Instead, I acknowledged that his anger was justified given his experience and asked him to help me understand. This acknowledgement immediately shifted the dynamic from confrontation to collaboration. I discovered that hostile energy can be transformed into engaged energy when properly channeled. Angry audiences are passionate audiences. They care deeply about the issues at hand. The key is redirecting that passion from opposition to exploration, from resistance to problem solving. The technique that proved most effective was finding common ground in seemingly impossible situations. Even the most divided groups usually share some fundamental concerns or values. In that Pittsburgh steel mill, management and workers both wanted the company to survive and thrive. They just disagreed about how to achieve that goal. I learned to listen for shared values beneath competing positions. When I could identify what everyone in the room cared about, I could build from that foundation toward mutual understanding. This approach doesn't eliminate disagreements, but it creates a framework for productive dialogue. My comeback from that speaking disaster taught me everything about resilience and authenticity under pressure. After acknowledging my limitations and listening to the workers' concerns, I was able to find genuine ways my message could address their real needs. The presentation that emerged from that conversation was far more valuable than the one I had originally prepared. I developed a framework for turning hostile situations around: acknowledge, listen, find common ground, and rebuild. Each step must be genuine. Audiences can detect insincerity immediately, especially when they're already suspicious. The acknowledge step requires you to validate the audience's right to their feelings, without necessarily agreeing with their conclusions. I can understand why you'd be frustrated by this situation is very different from your right to be frustrated. The first validates emotion. The second validates judgment. The listen step means truly hearing what people are saying, not just waiting for your turn to speak. Hostile audiences often become hostile because they feel unheard. When you demonstrate genuine curiosity about their perspective, you begin to diffuse their defensiveness. The find common ground step requires identifying shared values, concerns, or goals that everyone can agree on. This becomes the foundation for rebuilding trust and moving toward productive dialogue. The rebuild step involves crafting a new approach that addresses the audience's real concerns while still serving your legitimate objectives. This often means abandoning your original plan in favor of something more responsive to the situation. I also learned the importance of distinguishing between different types of difficult audiences. Some audiences are hostile due to past disappointments. Others are skeptical due to conflicting information. Still others are resistant due to fear of change. Each type requires a different approach. With disappointed audiences, you must acknowledge past failures and demonstrate how your approach will be different. With skeptical audiences, you must provide credible evidence and address their specific doubts. With resistant audiences, you must reduce perceived risks and create small wins that build confidence. The most challenging situation I learned to handle was the audience that included both supporters and opponents. In these mixed groups, you can't simply choose one side. You must find ways to speak to both simultaneously without alienating either. I developed techniques for acknowledging different perspectives in the room while still maintaining a coherent message. This often involves stating multiple viewpoints fairly before presenting your own perspective as one valid option among others. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that handling difficult audiences isn't about winning or losing, it's about serving. When your focus shifts from defending your position to understanding and addressing legitimate concerns, even hostile audiences can become collaborative partners. The steel workers who challenged me that day taught me that respect must be earned, not demanded. When I stopped trying to command their attention and started trying to earn their trust, everything changed. They became some of my most enthusiastic supporters because I had shown them genuine respect and concern. This experience transformed my entire approach to speaking. I learned to prepare not just for supportive audiences, but for skeptical ones. I developed the emotional resilience to handle challenges gracefully and the flexibility to adapt my message to serve my audience's real needs. The ultimate lesson from that disaster was that your worst speaking experience can become your greatest teacher if you're willing to learn from it. Difficult audiences aren't obstacles to overcome, their opportunities to develop deeper skills and more authentic connections. John F. Kennedy's inaugural address taught me that the most powerful words in any speech are often the last ones your audience hears. I had studied that speech dozens of times, focusing on its soaring rhetoric and inspirational vision. But it wasn't until I analyzed Kennedy's closing strategy that I understood why those final words, "Ask not what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country," became one of the most quoted lines in American history. Kennedy understood something that most speakers miss entirely. People remember endings. You can deliver a brilliant opening and compelling middle, but if you fumble the close, that's what your audience will carry with them. The ending isn't just the conclusion of your speech. It's the launching pad for the action you want your audience to take. I began studying the psychology of decision-making in groups and discovered why most speakers fail at this crucial moment. After being engaged and educated for 20 or 30 minutes, audiences experience what I call decision fatigue. They've processed information, considered implications, and felt emotions. By the time you reach your conclusion, their mental energy is depleted and their decision-making capacity is compromised. This is exactly when most speakers make their biggest mistake. They present their audience with complex choices, multiple options, or vague suggestions about what to do next. Kennedy's genius was recognizing that exhausted minds need simple, clear, compelling direction. Kennedy's formula for memorable calls to action became the foundation of my closing strategy. He didn't ask his audience to consider multiple options or think about various possibilities. He gave them one clear, specific action that aligned with their highest values and aspirations. He made the choice both simple and significant. Asterisk. The architecture of Kennedy's closing revealed 3 essential elements that every compelling close must contain: crystallization, inspiration, and direction. Each element serves a specific psychological purpose in moving people from engagement to action. Asterisk. Crystallization is where you distill everything you've shared into one clear, memorable insight. Kennedy crystallized the entire relationship between citizen and government into a single principle. Service flows from citizen to country, not country to citizen. This wasn't just a policy position, it was a fundamental reframe of civic responsibility. I learned to end my presentations by identifying the one key insight that captured everything we had discussed. This crystallization moment helps audiences understand not just what they've learned, but what it means for their lives. It transforms information into wisdom. Inspiration is where you connect your message to your audience's deepest values and highest aspirations. Kennedy didn't just ask people to serve their country. He positioned that service as the path to national greatness and historical significance. He made civic duty feel noble and heroic. I discovered that people don't just want to be informed, they want to be inspired to become better versions of themselves. The most compelling closes help audiences see how taking action aligns with who they want to be and what they want to achieve. Direction is where you provide specific, actionable next steps that feel both achievable and meaningful. Kennedy's call to action was crystal clear. Stop asking what you can receive and start asking what you can give. This direction was specific enough to be actionable yet broad, enough to apply to every citizen. The summary technique became another crucial element of effective closes. But I learned that effective summaries aren't just repetitions of your main points. They're progressive revelations that build toward your final call to action. I developed what I called the ascending summary approach. Instead of simply listing what we had covered, I would show how each point built toward an inevitable conclusion. This technique helps audiences feel that your call to action isn't just your preferences, the logical result of everything they've learned. Kennedy demonstrated this beautifully in his address. He began by acknowledging the challenges facing America, then outlined principles for meeting those challenges, and finally revealed that these principles required active citizen participation. His call to action felt inevitable, not imposed. Creating urgency without pressure became another essential skill. People need reasons to act now rather than later, but they resist feeling manipulated or rushed. Kennedy created urgency by positioning his audience as part of a historic moment with unprecedented challenges and opportunities. I learned to create what I call opportunity urgency, the sense that a valuable opportunity might be missed if action is delayed. This is different from crisis urgency, which can create resistance and resentment. Opportunity urgency inspires. Crisis urgency often backfires. The technique of future visualization proved particularly powerful in compelling closes. This is where you help your audience see and feel what success will look like if they take the action you're recommending. Kennedy was masterful at painting pictures of American leadership and freedom spreading around the world. I began ending presentations by helping audiences visualize their success in vivid detail. Instead of just telling them what to do, I helped them see themselves succeeding and feel the satisfaction of that success. This emotional preview creates motivation that purely logical arguments cannot generate. But perhaps the most important lesson Kennedy taught me about closing was the power of personal responsibility. His call to action didn't ask people to wait for others to act, it asked them to take personal responsibility for creating the change they wanted to see. I learned that the most compelling closes are the ones that empower individuals to make a difference regardless of what others choose to do. When you help people see how they personally can contribute to something meaningful, you tap into their deepest motivations for action. The ultimate test of any close is this: after hearing it, does your audience feel more confused or more confident about what to do next? Great closes don't just end speeches, they begin transformations. They don't just conclude presentations, they launch movements. Kennedy's inaugural address didn't just end a speech, began a presidency that inspired a generation to public service. His closing words became a rallying cry that outlasted his administration and continues to inspire civic engagement decades later. This taught me that the most powerful closes aren't really endings at all, they're beginnings. They're the moment when your audience stops listening to your ideas and starts living them. When you master the art of the compelling close, you transform from someone who informs to someone who inspires lasting change. Asterisk, asterisk, the realization that one size does not fit all in persuasive speaking came to me during a particularly humbling week in 1925. I had delivered what I thought was the same excellent presentation 3 times to 3 different audiences with dramatically different results. The boardroom executives loved it, the factory workers found it irrelevant, and the community group seemed confused by it entirely. This experience forced me to develop what I called my situation adaptation matrix, a systematic framework for adjusting persuasive techniques across different contexts, audiences, and objectives. I learned that the principles of persuasion remain constant, but their application must be infinitely flexible. The first major distinction one learned to make was between formal and informal speaking situations. Boardroom presentations require different approaches than casual conversations, not just in content, but in delivery style, pace, and even body language. The same message delivered with boardroom formality to a casual group feels stuffy and disconnected, while casual delivery in a formal setting can seem unprofessional and disrespectful. I discovered that formal situations call for more structured presentations with clear agendas, defined time boundaries, and professional language. The audience expects expertise, preparation, and respect for their time and position. In these contexts, your credibility comes partly from your preparation and partly from your ability to respect the formality of the occasion. Informal situations, however, reward authenticity, spontaneity, and personal connection over polished delivery. The same people who expect formality in their boardroom want genuine conversation at their company retreat. Your credibility in informal settings comes from your ability to be real, relatable, and responsive to the moment. The size of your audience fundamentally changes your approach to persuasion. Speaking to 5 people around a conference table requires intimate conversation, skills direct eye contact with each person, awareness of individual reactions, and the ability to adjust your message based on immediate feedback. Speaking to 500 people requires platform skills, broader gestures, stronger voice projection, and more theatrical delivery. I learned that small group speaking is about facilitation, drawing out participation, managing different personalities, and building consensus through dialogue. Large group speaking is about inspiration, creating shared experiences, building emotional momentum, and moving the collective toward common action. The challenge of mixed audiences, groups that include both supporters and skeptics, entirely different strategies. In these situations, You cannot simply appeal to one segment without alienating the other. I developed techniques for acknowledging different perspectives, while still maintaining a coherent message. The key with mixed audiences is what I call inclusive positioning. Instead of taking sides, you position yourself as someone who understands and respects different viewpoints while offering a path forward that serves everyone's legitimate interests. This requires more sophisticated messaging, but creates broader acceptance. Cultural considerations became increasingly important as my speaking opportunities expanded beyond American audiences. I learned that persuasion techniques that work beautifully in one culture can fail completely or even offend in another. Direct confrontation of objections, for example, works well in American business culture, but can be seen as disrespectful in cultures that value harmony and face-saving. I developed sensitivity to different cultural approaches to authority, time, decision-making, and conflict. Some cultures respect speakers who demonstrate extensive credentials and expertise. Others connect better with speakers who show humility and seek input from the audience. Understanding these differences isn't just polite, it's essential for persuasive effectiveness. The difference between selling ideas and inspiring action became another crucial distinction. When your goal is to get people to accept a concept or change their thinking, you focus on evidence, logic, and understanding. When your goal is to motivate specific behaviors, you focus on emotion, urgency, and practical steps. I learned that idea selling requires patience, you're changing minds, which takes time and careful argumentation. Action, inspiration, requires energy, you're changing behaviors, which requires emotional momentum and clear direction. The same content delivered with the wrong energy for your objective will fail regardless of how well crafted it is. The adaptation between different professional contexts required specific attention to industry cultures, terminology, and values. Speaking to engineers requires different approaches than speaking to artists, not just in content, but in style and structure. Engineers typically prefer logical progression, detailed evidence, and practical applications. Artists often respond better to stories, metaphors, and creative possibilities. I developed the practice of researching not just my audience's industry, but their professional culture. What do they value? How do they make decisions? What kind of evidence convinces them? What language do they use to describe their challenges and goals? Time constraints also demanded different approaches. A 5-minute elevator pitch requires completely different structure and focus than a 50-minute keynote address. With limited time, you must be ruthlessly selective about what to include and how to arrange it for maximum impact. I learned that shorter presentations aren't just condensed versions of longer ones. They're entirely different animals. Short presentations require immediate impact, crystal clear focus, and compelling calls to action. Longer presentations allow for more detailed development, multiple supporting arguments, and gradual persuasive building. The physical environment shapes audience expectations and receptiveness. A speech in a grand auditorium creates different psychological conditions than a presentation in a corporate conference room or a conversation in someone's office. Each environment has its own energy, formality level, and optimal communication style. I began paying careful attention to how physical spaces affect audience psychology and adjusting my approach accordingly. Large formal spaces tend to make audiences more passive and require more energy from the speaker. Small, intimate spaces make audiences more participatory and require more conversational approaches. The universal principles that work everywhere became my foundation for all these adaptations. Authenticity resonates across all cultures and contexts. Genuine concern for your audience's welfare creates connection regardless of the setting. Clear communication serves every purpose and every group. Stories work in every situation, though. The types of stories and the way you tell them must adapt to your context. Emotional connection matters in every persuasive situation, though the emotions you appeal to and how you create them vary dramatically. The key insight that emerged from all this adaptation work was that flexibility doesn't mean abandoning your core principles. It means expressing those principles in ways that resonate with each specific situation. The message adapts to serve the audience, but the integrity behind the message remains constant. This understanding transformed me from a speaker who delivered presentations to a communicator who created experiences appropriate to each unique situation and audience. The principles remained the same, but their application became as varied and nuanced as the human situations I encountered. The moment I realized that my reputation was speaking before I ever opened my mouth was both terrifying and liberating. I had been invited to address a group of business leaders in Chicago, and as I was introduced, I heard murmurs throughout the audience. "That's the Carnegie Fellow who teaches confidence to shy people." And I heard he helps people overcome their fear of speaking. In that instant, I understood that I had unknowingly developed what would later be called a personal brand, consistent identity and reputation that preceded every speaking engagement. The question wasn't whether I had a brand, but whether I was conscious and intentional about shaping it. This realization led me to develop my personal brand development worksheet, a systematic process for discovering and developing an authentic, persuasive voice. I learned that trying to copy other speakers was not only ineffective, was counterproductive. Audiences can sense authenticity from across a room, and they can equally detect when someone is trying to be someone they're not. The first step in building your personal speaking brand is discovering your authentic, persuasive voice. This isn't about finding what works for others. It's about identifying what works uniquely for you. I spent months analyzing my most successful speaking moments, looking for patterns in when I felt most confident and when audiences seemed most engaged. What I discovered was that my greatest strength lay not in my polished delivery or sophisticated content, but in my genuine empathy for people who struggled with the same fears I had overcome. My authentic voice emerged from my personal journey from terrified speaker to confident teacher, and audiences connected with that authenticity more than any technique I could have learned. I learned to ask myself crucial questions. What experiences have shaped my perspective? What challenges have I overcome that others are still facing? What unique insights have I gained from my journey? The answers to these questions became the foundation of my speaking identity. The danger of imitation became clear when I watched students try to copy speakers they admired. A naturally quiet, thoughtful person trying to adopt the boisterous style of a dynamic motivational speaker looked awkward and felt inauthentic. A naturally energetic person trying to replicate the measured dignity of a formal academic speaker seemed constrained and artificial. I developed the principle that your speaking persona must be an extension of your authentic self, not a replacement. For it, the goal isn't to become someone else. It's to become the most effective version of who you already are. This means identifying your natural strengths and learning to leverage them strategically. Some speakers are naturally warm and personal. Their strength lies in creating intimate connections, even with large audiences. Others are naturally analytical and logical. Their power comes from their ability to make complex ideas clear and compelling. Still others are naturally inspirational and visionary. They excel at painting pictures of possibility and motivating action. I learnt that building consistency across all communications was essential for developing a strong speaking brand. Your reputation is built not just on your formal presentations, but on every interaction, every conversation, and every written communication. People form impressions of your credibility and authenticity through all these touchpoints. This consistency doesn't mean being exactly the same in every situation. It means being recognizably you in every context. My commitment to helping people overcome fear and build confidence became the thread that connected all my communications. Whether I was speaking to executives, factory workers, or teachers, the concept of serving your message rather than serving your ego became central to authentic brand development. When your focus is on looking good or impressing people, your brand becomes about you. When your focus is on serving your audience and delivering value, your brand becomes about your contribution to others. I discovered that the most compelling personal brands are built around a mission larger than the speaker themselves. My brand wasn't really about Dale Carnegie. It was about the belief that every person has the potential to communicate confidently and persuasively if given the right tools and encouragement. Reputation management became another crucial aspect of building a speaking brand. I learned that your reputation is formed through the accumulated experiences of everyone who has heard you speak, worked with you, or even heard about you from others. This reputation either opens doors or closes them before you ever have a chance to prove yourself. The principle of under-promising and over-delivering became fundamental to my reputation building. When I consistently delivered more value than people expected, word spread quickly through professional networks. When speakers overpromise and underdeliver, their reputation suffers and opportunities diminish. I also learned that authenticity requires acknowledging your limitations and areas for growth. Trying to be seen as perfect in every aspect of speaking actually undermines credibility. People trust speakers who are honest about their own development journey and who continue learning and improving. The development of signature stories, phrases, and approaches became another element of brand building. Over time, I became known for certain anecdotes, particular ways of explaining concepts, and specific techniques that people associated with my teaching. These signature elements made my content recognizable and memorable, but I learned that signature elements must emerge naturally from your authentic voice and experience. They can't be manufactured artificially. The stories that became part of my brand were the ones that genuinely illustrated principles I believed in and had lived through personally. Building a speaking persona that serves your message requires ongoing self-reflection and adjustment. As I gained experience and developed new insights, my speaking brand evolved while maintaining its core identity. The key was allowing natural growth while preserving the authentic elements that made my voice distinctive. I discovered that your speaking brand isn't just what you say about yourself, it's what others say about you after you've left the room. The most powerful brand building happens through the experiences you create for your audiences and the value they receive from those experiences. The ultimate test of an authentic speaking brand is sustainability. Can you maintain this persona consistently over time? Does it align with who you really are, or does it require you to pretend to be someone else? If your brand requires constant acting, it will eventually collapse under the weight of its own artificiality. I learned that the speakers with the most enduring influence are those whose personal brand aligns so closely with their authentic self that there's no gap between the person and the persona. When you achieve that alignment, speaking becomes not a performance, but a natural expression of who you are and what you believe. Building your personal speaking brand isn't about creating an image. It's about discovering and developing your unique voice in service of your authentic message. When you get this right, your reputation becomes your greatest asset, opening doors and creating opportunities to serve audiences who need exactly what you have to offer. My speaking journal from 1925 contains an entry that changed my entire approach to professional development. Today, I discovered that I'd been making the same mistake for 3 months without realizing it. I rush through my closing arguments when I'm nervous, undermining everything I've built up to that point. How many other blind spots do I have? This moment of uncomfortable self-awareness led me to develop a systematic approach to continuous improvement that transformed not just my speaking ability, but my entire philosophy of mastery. I realized that the difference between good speakers and great speakers isn't talent, it's their commitment to deliberate, ongoing development. The practice regimen I developed became the foundation for everything that followed. I began treating speaking like a professional athlete treats their sport, with daily practice, careful analysis of performance, and constant attention to technique refinement. This wasn't casual improvement, it was systematic skill building. Every morning, I would spend 30 minutes practicing specific elements of delivery. Monday focused on vocal variety and pacing. Tuesday emphasized gesture and movement. Wednesday concentrated on storytelling techniques. Thursday worked on handling questions and objections. Friday integrated everything into practice presentations. But the real breakthrough came when I learned to practice with intention rather than just repetition. Simply giving more speeches doesn't automatically make you better. You must actively analyze what works, what doesn't, and why. Random practice creates random results. Deliberate practice creates systematic improvement. I developed what I called performance dissection, a methodical process for analyzing every speaking engagement. Within 24 hours of each presentation, I would record detailed observations about what went well, what could be improved, and what I wanted to experiment with next time. This analysis wasn't casual reflection, it was systematic investigation. I would examine my opening's effectiveness, track audience engagement throughout the presentation, analyze which stories or examples resonated most, and evaluate my closing's impact. I treated each speaking opportunity as both a performance and a learning laboratory. The feedback-seeking process became another crucial element of improvement. I learned to actively solicit honest feedback from trusted colleagues, mentors, and even audience members. But I discovered that effective feedback requires asking specific questions rather than general ones. Instead of asking, "How did I do?" I would ask, "What moment did you find most engaging?" Or "When did you feel I lost the audience's attention?" Or "Which of my 3 main points was clearest?" Specific questions generate useful feedback. General questions typically produce polite, but useless responses. I also learned to distinguish between different types of feedback. Some feedback addresses technical delivery issues, voice, gesture, pacing. Other feedback concerns content, organization, and clarity. Still, other feedback relates to audience connection and persuasive impact. Each type requires different responses and improvement strategies. The most valuable feedback often came from unexpected sources. A janitor once told me that my speeches were too fancy for the factory workers I was addressing. That casual comment led me to completely revise my approach to blue-collar audiences and significantly improve my effectiveness with those groups. Learning from every speaking opportunity became another fundamental principle. Even failed presentations offered valuable lessons if I was willing to examine them honestly. In fact, my worst speaking disasters often taught me more than my biggest successes because they forced me to confront weaknesses I might otherwise have ignored. I developed the habit of identifying at least 3 specific lessons from every speaking engagement. These lessons became entries in my speaking journal and formed the basis for future practice sessions. Over time, this systematic learning approach accelerated my development far beyond what random experience alone could have achieved. The concept of compound improvement revolutionized my understanding of mastery. Small, consistent improvements in multiple areas create exponential rather than linear growth. Improving your opening by 10%, your stories by 10%, and your closing by 10% doesn't give you 30% better results. Creates multiplicative impact that can transform your entire effectiveness. I began focusing on incremental improvements across all aspects of speaking rather than trying to perfect one element at a time. This approach prevented the common mistake of becoming excellent in one area while remaining weak in others. Balanced development created overall strength that served me in every speaking situation. Mentoring others became an unexpected path to my own improvement. When I began teaching other speakers, I was forced to articulate principles I had been applying intuitively. Teaching others clarified my own understanding and revealed gaps in my knowledge that I needed to address. I discovered that explaining techniques to struggling speakers often led to breakthrough insights about those techniques. When a student couldn't understand a concept I was teaching, I had to find new ways to explain it, and those new explanations often improved my own application of the principle. The practice of studying master speakers became another cornerstone of continuous improvement. I made it a habit to attend speeches by renowned speakers whenever possible, not as a casual audience member, but as a student analyzing technique. I would take detailed notes on their methods, timing, and audience management strategies. But I learned to study speakers analytically rather than imitatively. Instead of trying to copy their techniques directly, I would ask, what principle is this speaker applying? How could I apply that same principle in my own authentic style? What can I learn from their approach that fits with my natural strengths? The development of speaking challenges and experiments kept my improvement process engaging and dynamic. I would set specific goals for each presentation. I had new opening technique, experiment with different pacing, test a new story or practice handling hostile questions. These experiments turned every speaking opportunity into a controlled learning experience. Some experiments failed, but the failures taught me as much as the successes. This experimental mindset prevented my speaking from becoming stale or formulaic. The journal writing process became essential for tracking progress and maintaining motivation. When improvement happens gradually over months and years, it's easy to lose sight of how far you've come. My journal entries from earlier years reminded me of challenges that once seemed insurmountable, but had become natural parts of my speaking ability. Reading old journal entries also revealed patterns in my development, recurring challenges, breakthrough moments, and cyclical struggles. These patterns helped me understand my learning process and anticipate future development needs. That the ultimate realization was that mastery isn't a destination, it's a way of traveling. There's no point at which you arrive as a speaker and can stop growing. The most accomplished speakers I knew were also the most committed to continuous learning, because they understood that complacency is the enemy of excellence. This understanding transformed my relationship with improvement from a burden to a joy. Instead of feeling pressured to reach some imaginary perfect state, I learned to appreciate the ongoing journey of development. Each day brought opportunities to refine, experiment, and grow. The compound effect of consistent improvement over years created results that seemed impossible when I started. The terrified young man who trembled through his first presentation had become someone who could confidently address any audience on any topic. But that transformation didn't happen overnight. It emerged through thousands of small improvements accumulated over time. Asterisk. As I write this final letter to future speakers, I'm struck by a profound truth that has taken me decades to fully understand. The ultimate measure of persuasive speaking isn't the applause you receive, it's the positive change you create in the lives of others. The greatest speakers in history aren't remembered for their eloquence, they're remembered for their impact. Throughout my journey from a terrified farm boy to someone who has taught 750,000 people to communicate with confidence, I've learned that persuasive power comes with profound responsibility. When you can move people with your words, you hold in your hands the ability to influence the direction of their lives, their careers, and their relationships. This responsibility has shaped everything I've taught and practiced. The techniques I've shared with you aren't just tools for getting what you want. They're instruments for serving others and contributing to something larger than yourself. The moment your persuasive ability becomes about manipulation rather than service, you've lost the very authenticity that makes persuasion possible. I've watched students use these principles to transform their careers, strengthen their relationships, and build successful businesses. But the letters that mean the most to me are the ones from people who've used their improved communication skills to help others, the manager who learned to inspire instead of intimidate, the parent who found better ways to guide their children, the community leader who learned to unite rather than divide. The responsibility that comes with persuasive power extends beyond individual interactions to the broader impact you have on your community and society. Great speakers have the ability to shape culture, influence values, and guide collective decision-making. This influence must be wielded with wisdom, integrity, and genuine concern for the welfare of others. I've seen the dark side of persuasive power when it's used selfishly or carelessly. Speakers who use these techniques purely for personal gain often achieve short-term success, but create long-term damage to relationships and trust. The principles I've taught you are powerful precisely because they're rooted in genuine service to others. When that foundation is removed, they become tools of manipulation rather than transformation. Using your influence to serve others isn't just morally right, it's practically effective. When people sense that you're genuinely concerned about their welfare and success, they naturally become more open to your influence. When they feel you're only concerned about your own agenda, they resist even your best ideas. This understanding has led me to what I consider the highest application of persuasive speaking, helping others discover and develop their own voices. The ultimate compliment I can receive isn't "you're a great speaker," but "you helped me become a better speaker." When you use your influence to empower others rather than just advance yourself, you create a legacy that extends far beyond your own lifetime. The great speakers who have shaped history shared this common characteristic. They used their persuasive power to elevate others rather than just themselves. Lincoln used his speaking ability to preserve the Union and free the enslaved. Roosevelt used his to restore confidence during economic crisis. Kennedy used his to inspire a generation to public service. Each of these leaders understood that true persuasive power comes from connecting personal success with collective benefit. When your goals align with the legitimate interests of your audience, persuasion becomes collaboration rather than conquest. Building a legacy through the lives you touch requires thinking beyond immediate results to long-term impact. Every time you speak, you're not just influencing decisions, you're potentially changing how people think about themselves and their possibilities. A single presentation that helps someone believe in their potential can alter the trajectory of their entire life. I've received thousands of letters over the years from people describing how learning to communicate effectively changed everything. For them, they got promoted, started businesses, strengthened marriages, became community leaders, and found the confidence to pursue dreams they had previously thought impossible. These transformations remind me why this work matters so deeply. The ripple effects of your influence extend far beyond the people you directly address. When you help someone become a more confident and effective communicator, they carry that improvement into every relationship and interaction for the rest of their lives. They become better parents, colleagues, friends, and leaders. Your influence multiplies through their improved relationships with others. This multiplication effect means that every person you help communicate more effectively becomes a force for positive change in their own sphere of influence. Your legacy isn't just the people you directly impact, it's the countless others they go on to influence with the confidence and skills you helped them develop. How great speakers shape History isn't just through major speeches or dramatic moments, it's through the accumulated impact of countless individual transformations. When you help people find their voices, express their ideas, and influence their own communities, you're contributing to the larger project of human progress and understanding. My final challenge to you as a persuasive speaker is this: use every opportunity to speak as a chance to serve others and contribute to something meaningful. Whether you're addressing a boardroom, a classroom, or a community meeting, ask yourself not just what do I want to achieve, but how can I help these people succeed? When you approach every speaking opportunity with genuine service in mind, several things happen simultaneously. First, your authenticity increases because you're aligned with your highest values. Second, your persuasive power grows because people sense your genuine concern for their welfare. Third, your satisfaction deepens because you're contributing to something larger than yourself. The principles I've shared with you, from understanding your audience to crafting compelling closes, all work most powerfully when they're applied in service of others. When you use these techniques to help people solve problems, achieve goals, and realize potential, you're not just becoming a better speaker, you're becoming a better human being as you continue developing your persuasive abilities. Remember that the greatest speakers are measured not by their technique, but by their contribution. Master these skills not just to advance your own agenda, but to serve others and leave the world a little better than you found it. The terrified young man who once trembled behind a curtain in a YMCA basement never imagined he would have the privilege of sharing these insights with you. If that transformation is possible for someone who started with such fear and limitation, imagine what's possible for you as you apply these principles with dedication, integrity, and genuine care. For others, your voice matters. Your message matters. The lives you touch through effective communication matter. Use these gifts wisely, and you'll discover that the greatest reward of persuasive speaking isn't getting what you want, it's helping others get what they need to create the lives they truly desire. The stage is yours. The audience is waiting. The only question is, what legacy will you create with the power of your words?